With the last city we created, I showed you how you can take individual objects and kind of place them into sort of a grid. And we modified with extrusions the individual cubes or other objects that were modeled and placed in. I want to show another method for creating buildings and using extrusions. It's a little more direct and avoids any sort of overlapping. It does give you a little more control over the layout. So I'm going to start by adding in a plane object, and we're going to stick with 20 by 20 for the width and height. We're going to switch over the top view, and what I want to do is select the freehand spline tool and just draw in some different roads. And these are going to be more of the main streets and the main roads. So this would represent a larger area. And then what I'm going to do is select all of these splines. Under functions, we can select connect. And then I'm going to go back and select the splines again and hit Alt-G on the keyboard to group them together. And then just hide the null object with those splines just to kind of preserve them in case we end up needing them again. I'm also going to create a duplicate of this spline with all of them grouped. And we'll go ahead and rename that spline group. And we can just hide that for now, but keep it out. So what I want to do is intersect the plane with the spline, so we can hit C on the keyboard or go to functions, make editable, in order to convert it to polygons. And then I'm going to add a Boolean object, and we also need to add geometry to the spline and the combination of splines. And what I'm going to use is the extrude NURBS. Drag that spline, and I'm going to change this over to 20 meters on the Y. We could just move the model down a little to intersect, and then add them to the Boolean object. I'm going to switch over to the line view mode. And if you need to, you can play around between high quality, having that on and off, going through some of the different modes in order to get it to look like the way I have it right now. And then we can go ahead and make that editable and delete our null object. So now we have some variation. I do want to remove the triangles for the moment. So we can select the plane and under functions untriangulate, set the angle to 90, and remove any 3-point polygons. And there's more than one method I want to show you, so I also want to just copy and paste this plane and save it so we can come back. What I want to do is add in a displace deformer from the MoGraph menu. Add this to the plane, and what I want to do is just raise up the height, go to the shading, and just set it to a color that will raise all of it. And then under the fall off menu, we're going to change the shape from infinite to source. And our source is going to be that spline that we used to create the original cuts and those other roads and kind of shaping out the city. We can invert it if we need to. Anytime you use a spline as a source, you get a sample detail amount that you can set. That will define how much of the spline is used to influence. And then you can modify the overall sample distance. Now we can also adjust fall off. Where we have a function, we can choose different fall off modes. Because this is such low amount of geometry, we're not going to really see much of a change. The spline gives us a little more control over the way we want to displace this. And we'll see why I'm displacing this in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and reset this to default, set it to linear. I think that's going to be good right there. So I'm going to right-click on the object and current state to object. So it'll give me a displaced or modified plane. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to Functions and untriangulate. I'm going to turn on Create N-GONs and set that value to, say, 5. And what that's going to do is create a very large polygon around the bottom and some larger polygons on the sides. And then what I want to do is triangulate. So from Functions, select Triangulate. So that gives us somewhat of a different shape and look to everything. And it's really just an easy way to kind of maneuver the polygons around to form more interesting shapes. We can then untriangulate this again, but turn off the Create N-GONs to set the angle to 90. If I switch to the scale mode, we can kind of squish this down. And we see a lot different of a grid than we had before. Gives us some nice variations. And then if we want to go back, use that spline to cut this again, we can build upon it more and create more interesting shapes and a more interesting layout, so that we're not just working with a flat grid. And the reason I used the displaced deformer before was so that when I create the N-GONs, it doesn't remove everything. The more angle there is, the more and more variation there is throughout the object, the better it's going to look overall. So that's something kind of cool we can do. I also want to go back, turn that off, and go back to the plane object with the displaced deformer. One thing we can do, turning off the displaced deformer, going to the plane, I'm going to add in the polygon reduction, and we can use this to modify the look a little bit more. And actually, I think I do want to go back to get another baked version of this before I do that. So turn on the displaced deformer. I want more variation, so I'm going to change the sample distance, and we can adjust the fall-off amount to set it to 100, and that way it bends in more. This is a cool way you can sculpt a landscape to or also place a landscape around roads. Since we could use the sweep spline or sweep NURBS with the spline in order to create roads that would intersect with that. So now if I drag the polygon reduction just below the displace deformer, we can get a much better look because it has more depth to it. It's not just flattened out. The reason why it was showing such a minimal amount of polygons was because it was just way too flat. So by slicing it, or using the Boolean object, we ended up with a lot of extra geometry, and really mainly to reduce the n-gon amount that's created automatically. So now we can just go beyond that and modify this just by extruding it outward. So even if you don't have MoGraph, you could go in to the object and manually kind of displace it before you do polygon reduction. One nice thing about this method, as opposed to the other one I just showed, is that the road outlines remain pretty much the same. And they're pretty close to the original design. Now modifying this to show you the shape isn't going to work perfectly because I am using it to modify the geometry and control that displace deformer. And I would like a little more detail around the edges. So it looks like we probably just need to modify that displace deformer. In order to get some more geometry. Either that, or it might just be because there is really only one road right there that comes through with any variation. So if we need to, we can modify the spline. Switch over to the X-ray mode if you can't see the spline. You do need to turn it on. So we can just go through here and move that into position. Maybe come over here on the sides, switch to the Move tool, right click, which looks like at the moment it's not letting me do. Normally we can choose between an axis, but that might not apply with the spline. And so we'll go over here and just even that out a little. So it's starting to look a little bit better. Give us a little more detail. We'll just have this one kind of go off to the edge. Get some flatter areas up on top. This is also a good idea, or a good way to increase the detail of the polygons around, say, a river. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a road. It could be rivers as well. And we would normally have a population around water, so that works out pretty realistically. So now we can right-click on the object, switch the model mode, right-click, current state to object, and then I'm just going to drag the other two objects into that null. That's our backup. And then I'm going to select this plane and go back to functions and untriangulate, making sure that the create n-gons is turned off. And there we have a good starter object. In case I want to keep that height, copy and paste, and rename it, add it to my little backup group. And then we can just reduce the height of the model and now what I want to do is start subdividing different areas where I want more of an increased amount of buildings. The main idea behind this is to extrude the individual polygons from this mesh. And then create buildings from that, which we have a lot of different techniques that can be used for that. So before I subdivide, what I'm going to do is switch over to the rectangular selection tool, select edges, turn off select only visible elements, and select all of the edges. Then go to selection and set the selection. I'm going to go to the point mode and set a selection. And then do the same thing for polygons. Just because sometimes it's a little bit easier to pull out some of the larger sections further along, and it's going to take a lot longer. It might even be impossible to perform some of the actions, primarily with the edges, once we reach the next step here. So with the plane selected, we're going to go up to Functions and Subdivide. I'm going to do a HyperNURB subdivide of 1. And that's going to give us a lot more variation. And each of these individual edges showing could also be used as roads. If you want to smooth the mesh out a little bit, you can switch over to polygon mode, go to structure, select the iron tool, and then you can just kind of move that in a little bit just to round out the roads a little bit more in some areas where they look like they should be rounded. And anywhere we're having where we have too many polygons, where they're too close together, what I want to do is just select the polygons and use Z on the keyboard to melt them, just to avoid any extrusion problems later. It looks like that was really the only one that was going to be an issue. And what I can do to remove an n-gon is just switch to the knife tool, K on the keyboard, and we can just knife that. It is non-planar, so what's happening is it is being stretched out a bit. Also, I'm going to switch over to the points mode, select that point, move it over, and that should help. In the polygon mode, we can also go in now and start selecting if we want to increase any subdivisions anywhere, or make a selection for the areas in which we want to have buildings. So we could go around the roads and just pull out some random areas. This way. You could also have made this selection in the before subdividing and made a selection in order to pull out some of the areas that match the road shapes. That could work a little bit better, really depending on the look you're going for, which it'll be easier to see once we start building this up to understand how you may want to do this yourself to customize it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a selection, set the selection. I also want to go over to the edges, and we can see the edges from before are still selected from that previous look before the subdivision. So if we want to create roads at this level, we can. And that is what is stored in our selection. I want to create a new selection that's going to be all these edges before I subdivide again. Selection, set the selection. We could do points if needed, just to be on the safe side in case they are needed. It's a good idea just to have them, because you never know when you're going to end up wanting to use the point connections or point areas to control something. So now I'm going to subdivide the mesh again. Functions, subdivide, turn off the hyperNURBs this time. Subdivide once. And this way we start to get more of that grid and straighter look. And then really just depending on how many roads you want to have or how large the city is going to be, you can continue to subdivide, because each of our polygons is going to end up being a building. Or we could set it up with a different cloner object to create a set of buildings or assign rows to the edges. A lot of different ways to control the placement using the cloner objects. So now I'm going to go over to the polygon selection that we made earlier, which is still there in the mesh. So if these are going to be our city areas, we can subdivide this further. So go to Functions, Subdivide, subdivide one more time. And I think I'm going to stick with that, which should work out pretty well. And then what we can do, as we are going to be randomizing this a bit more, I want to switch over to Edge Selections. So we can see this could be basically our major roads if we want to have that. And I do actually want to go back. I'm going to go to the before the subdivision, selecting the polygons where those are, and I do need to do a convert selection of polygons to edges. So go to the edges, and since this selection is already set, now we're going to convert, because these are going to be our roads we can use at this level. So making sure there's no selection tags currently selected, we can go and set the selection. Go back to the polygons, and now subdivide. And now we're going to add roads. So we're going to go to the edges. Use those edges from the converted selection. And also go back and use the first set of edges. And then what we can do to create the roads is hit M and then S in order to bevel. And then we can just draw out and create our road area. And actually, I'm going to undo that, turn on Create N-GONS, and re-apply. And actually, to set the correct materials on this, I'm going to undo it and go back to the polygon mode. Since this selection is already remembered as part of the larger selection, I'm going to select everything and then go back to the edge mode, MS, to turn on the bevel. And now if we go to the polygon mode, we should have an exact opposite selection, with the exception a few areas that might need to be corrected. But if we go to Selection and then Invert, we should have our roads. So I'm going to create a new material, call it Roads, and drag that onto that polygon selection. And it did create a new one. And what we could do to see this a little better is we can darken those. Just switch to the model mode, turn off that display, and now we can see the road layout taking place. I can turn off that other spline so it's not getting in the way. But we can see a nice little city grid showing up. And in the polygon mode, I'm going to create first a new material and just call it land. Go to the selection, invert it, and drag that land surface, which will go ahead and just create sort of a green look to it. And if you want to create any roads beyond this point, say subdividing any of these sections any further, you can easily do that, create new edges, add new roads. I typically like to do it using the bevel and creating all the roads at once, because it's just easier to create that selection tag. So if you did want to subdivide any individual area more, it'd probably be a good idea to do it before you do the large subdivision of everything, or the large bevel. But what I want to continue doing now is go to the polygon mode, and we're going to start to extrude some of this stuff out. So I'm going to grab our selection from earlier. So deselect everything. Actually, I'm going to undo what I just did because I did have the bevel still turned on. So I'm going to switch to the live selection, deselect, go to that polygon selection, select the polygons. If you want to randomize this a little, there's a great plugin called Chestnuts. And what it allows you to do is set either points or polygons and a random select mode. Now, since we already have something selected, it will deselect from the current selection. What I can do is select, say, 50% or 49. So now we could use just these polygons to create buildings from, if we wanted to apply that way. So that's kind of a cool way to add a randomization. Another thing you could do is use that plugin, and this would have been done before creating the roads. What you would do is have a minimal selection, and you can melt the polygons together in order to create some larger areas. It's not really going to work right now. It might still work, because we do have some different pieces. So anytime we have two polygons next to each other selected and we melt it, we're going to get some larger polygon blocks, and that's going to give us different building shapes. Right now I think that this is actually probably too large. I think the buildings are going to be way bigger than I might want them to be. So we could subdivide further if needed, but I think this will work overall. So we're going to go back. I just keep that open in my interface. It's pretty nice. I use it quite frequently. I'm going to go back to that selection tag and select the polygons. And now with those randomizations. And we're going to split this from the object. So we're going to go to Functions and Split. So now we have an object that we can extrude the individual polygons from. And we can go ahead and remove any of the selection or the material tags. Because we won't need them. And the first thing we want to do is open up our MoGraph menu. And we're going to add in the poly effects. Because the first thing we need to do is shrink down the size of the polygons. So go to Transform. And we could cut them in half by just using 0.5 all the way around. If you want a little randomization in the scale, we could then add a random effector, turning off position. Although we could use position a little. For very small movements. So say 0.1 on the X and the Z, just so it's not perfect, unless of course you want it perfect. And we could randomize the scale a little. We'll just do a uniform scale. And 0.2 ought to work pretty well. And then what we can do is add in the extrude deformer. And under Object, I'm going to set this to extrusion step of 1 per step. We also need to set up a selection for this object. So we're going to select the plane, select all of these polygons, and we could also use chestnuts this way too. So if we didn't want every single object to create a building. This is another way to modify the selection of buildings. We're going to make sure none of the other selection tags are selected and set the selection. And now we can add the extrude deformer and add that polygon selection to the polygon selection of the extrusion. So now we can see all of those objects showing, and their different scales. Of course, the extrusion is way too much. So we'll go to Extrude, Transform, and I might want to go back or go to the random effector and maybe modify the polygons a little further. But what I'm going to do in the extrusion right now is just set the size to 1. Go back to that random effector. And if we want, we could turn off that uniform scale. And we should be able to modify this a little further. I am going to go to the minimum and set that to 0, or maybe negative 50. That should be just enough to prevent any issues. And now it's basically at a point where we can perform the same actions as in the previous portion of the training, on the CityGen, where we just extruded all the buildings and controlled the steps. So if we go to the extrusion, we can set a maximum step amount, say 6, for taller buildings, and then add in an effector. And we'll go ahead and use a random effector. Turn off all the transform modes, but under Other, turn on visibility. And then we can set under effector our values for the minimum, maximum, and how we want to control the scale. Turning off the animation speed. So these are much larger buildings. And I'm going to go ahead and take the Phong shader and the Phong tag and reduce that angle limit to 5. So now we can apply the same sort of techniques in the previous portion. I really just wanted to show you some different ways to create city layouts rather than just using a grid, to be able to kind of plan it out a little bit more. So obviously we could go through, if I was to spend more time on this, and create maybe a better selection tag, or a better selection of polygons to split, or go in and subdivide areas a little bit more, because obviously we have a lot of roads that have not been added to the tag that don't really have any objects for them. Just for this right now, I'm going to go ahead and reduce the step amount 0.5. Not working in real world here, real world scale. We can also use the spline from earlier to use as a fall off for any of the other effectors as well. So if we wanted to adjust the fall off of the poly effects, we can set that to source, drag in our spline, invert if necessary, and then use the sample detail and the sample distance. At this point, keying it in would probably work better. And then we should be able to adjust just the overall fall off along that spline. And we do need to turn the spline on in order for that to properly show up. So you can see we can perform some pretty neat effects here. So that way we could have smaller buildings around the road section. It's really a matter of going through and making more modifications if needed, or setting up another poly effects on before the object, before this one, to use this source fall off. So we could also set that to the scale being 0 and have that fall off. Just lots of cool ways to control these buildings and different city layouts this way.